across borders. It's going to be the interlinkages between young people, especially from the global north and the global south. Because right now I would say there's a general agreement that certain things need to be done. The real climate action should be taken, and not things that policymakers, not the very short-term measures policymakers would like to promote points and maybe get another slot to get into office for another 4 years. And you know, the crisis of global warming must be placed squarely on where it is. It has
Is it just me, or have we lost Nnimmo now as well?
It has very deep roots, colonial roots. It has roots exploitation of labor. It has, you're not hearing me?
Nnimmo, could you try turning your camera off? Sorry, and that might be better.
Yeah, maybe that will help. Right.
Right, Nnimmo, are you speaking now?
Actually, the tree looks better, doesn't it? You hear me at all?
I think the audio is better now. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. I was saying that the solution to the crisis we're having is not going to be found in current political structures. The political structures need to be overturned, and we need more young people stepping forward from across the world. It's global solidarity of young people who feel the pain, who see how politicians right now are dragging the entire world away from the pathways of solution. One exercise that we all need to do is to move forward 50 years and start looking back. Look at the world. What is your picture of 50 years from now? There used to be a slogan, how old will you be in 50 years? And people answer that question very sincerely, that they're just playing games with the rest of the world. And so if we step forward and look back over the years, then we can draw up the policies, the actions that we must take that will bring us to the preferred future. Otherwise, we just dancing between the trees. And up to me is that up to Copenhagen in 2009, there was a glimmer of hope that the world could take a dramatic position to ensure that those who have created the problems most would do the most to solve the problem. But from Copenhagen in 2009, we had the voluntary system. And the voluntary system means business as usual. And we hear politicians always saying that they don't believe in business as usual, but that is what the voluntary system is. That is what the Paris Agreement is. The Paris Agreement consolidated. The Copenhagen Accord, whatsoever they feel like pledging. And they can say they will take actions now, or they will take action somewhere down the road. And so everybody's doing whatever they can to avoid immediate action. And so this is compounding inequality, driving citizens of this world to become involuntary migrants or refugees. And the pressures are just too much. I take example from my country. In my country, Nigeria, we're having the pressure of the certification in the north. We're having water industry that Ken was talking about operate. We're having coastal land loss, a massive land loss due to sea level rise. And because the land is also subsiding in nature. So any slight rise in sea level compounds the problem. In Africa, between 2019 and today, they've had severe cyclones, which have arisen due to the fact that the Indian Ocean is getting warmer. And so you're having freak cyclones, we're having locusts run on the eastern seaboard of Africa, and all these things will get worse as long as climate action is still not being taken. And what is the climate action? It's not about carbon capture and storage. It's about leaving the carbon in the ground. leaving the oil in the ground, leaving the coal in the ground, leaving the gas in the land. We have to move dramatically away from current modes of energy production, common modes current modes of production, bring people, give them a hope of a future that is livable. And again, if I should go back to my introduction, my conclusion is that the hope for a livable planet is squarely in the hands of young people across the world. The current leaders we have had their days, and I don't believe they really care about what happens tomorrow. And the industry that is propelling this problem is looking for profits. We all know that a high percentage, 80% of known fossil fuel reserves should be left in the ground, but yet the industry is seeking for more reserves, seeking where to frack, seeking where to drill, seeking what to burn. And all this translates to pumping more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere around vulnerable territories. And when nations go under, as the Pacific nation, some small island states may go under the waves, you're wiping out not just territories, you're wiping out cultures, you're wiping out spiritualities, you are wiping out, so you are wiping the memories of humankind. As to stand firm despite and work together in solidarity to a future that we can dream, especially that you can dream as young people. That is the pathway to the future. It's pathway to justice. Thank you for
thank you.
I hope you are hearing.
Nnimmo, I think we caught the majority of it. I don't know about other people, but it was spotty for me. But thank you so much. What you said was powerful, especially kind of the focus on youth and young people and thinking long term and trying to imagine us in 50 years' time. I thought that was super powerful. And the Wi-Fi problems that we've been having this evening makes me think that actually part of having international solidarity would be having patience for these types of things, but also lobbying for like better Wi-Fi across borders, maybe, perhaps. I think I'm going to pass on to Asad now. So Asad spoke at a Cambridge event last week and it was great. And somebody commented afterwards that hearing you speak, Asad, is like having your batteries recharged, which is a great metaphor. And also very apt considering we were talking about extractivism and the global Green New Deal and mining and all things like that. So batteries is a very apt metaphor in that case. Asad is the executive director of War on Want, a radical anti-poverty and social justice charity fighting poverty, inequality and human rights violations. He has over 35 years worth of experience in this field and is a coordinator of the Global Green New Deal project and has also been heavily active in anti-racism and anti-war work. So over to you, Asad, and very much looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Anjum, and thank you, comrades. And I'm so sorry, probably people are bored with me in Cambridge, but it feels like my second home. Obviously, a site of great activism there. First of all, thank you for the kind invitation to come and join you this evening. So I wanted to just speak about, what does solidarity across borders mean? And I think for me, one of the main things actually is the need for us to rebuild internationalism. Just as as Nnimmo was talking, and I remember this quote that I heard earlier, late last year. COVID is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all, the fiction that unpaid care work is not work, the delusion that we live in a post-racist world, the myth that we're in the same boat. Now that quote's not from Bernie Sanders, Angela Davis, or Nnimmo. It's actually from, incredibly, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, right? And to me, it speaks to the moment we live in. It's a profound moment that we're living in. And it's a moment that I think we all know is right for progressives, not just to tinker around the edges, but to be able to articulate a bold and radical vision, a vision that, you know, throws off the shackles of neoliberalism, and one that allows us to imagine a very, very different reality, a different world that we want to inhabit. I've always remarked that, you know, one of the neoliberalism's greatest crimes was that it stole our ability to be able to imagine and dream. And it's true that so many people, so many progressive people in the global north simply internalized neoliberal values and principles, even within progressive discourses. The market was king. All we could ever do was tinker around the edges. They believed that nothing came before and nothing would come after. It was, after all, as was famously said, the end of history. And even within that, they've tried to take away the stories of struggles and resistance and victories. You know, even at the very moment as movements were taken to the streets across the global south. And it feels like an age ago now to remember, you know, the moments we used to look at the pictures in Chile or in Lebanon and Iraq of people on the streets calling for change, not for individual policies, but for system change. And that slogan that was rebounded in Chile, this is not about 30 cents, it's about 30 years, as the Chilean movements brought together the labor movement, the feminists, environmentalists, young people, and the dispossessed. But even in the global north, you know, while some people continue to spin the lie that change could only come if we triangulate to the right. You have to make a devil's pact, accept the logic of the right on immigration and racism, and we can win some progress on economic or climate justice issues. And an example of that is, you know, it's often lauded in climate world. You know, look at Denmark. And what incredible, it's a red-green government there doing amazing things in terms of around renewable energy. And at the same time, enacting some of the most draconian anti-immigration policies and anti-Muslim policies far out to the right of what the far right was arguing. And, you know, and it shows to some extent the paucity and the hollowness of where some of our progressive movements have stood. And of course, the biggest lie of all, that economic liberalization would inevitably result in social justice or human rights. And Nnimmo speaks very eloquently, of course, to that in terms of talking about the role of the oil industry in Nigeria and oil across the world. So our challenge is, how do we have a vision for justice that is international in scope, but is really anchored in this understanding that we don't want to build back better, right? Back is not where we want to go. We need to be able to dial forward to something better, that our solutions can't even retreat behind the walls of the nation state. They've got to be global and universal. So I want to say something about that vision. And of course, we have to have a vision that addresses this permanent crisis faced by the global south. You know, this logic of, I would say, of sacrifice. And you can trace that logic back, of course, right back to the doctrine of discovery, slavery and colonialism, right through to neoliberalism and to the climate crisis. And of course, now to the corona pandemic. And these are all, of course, interlinked crises, and I would say they're the legacy of racialized capitalism. And so recognizing that these decades of neoliberal policies and this decade of austerity here in the UK sits in this arc of exploitation is really, really important, because then we begin to understand this, how Black and brown people, working people, women, the most marginalized, and of course our planet, its life systems, the environment, and much of what we rely on the world have all been sacrificed in the pursuit of one thing, which is profit for the few. So to do that, I think we have to recognize some truths about our vision, our political demands, and our understanding of the fight we need to fight, and how we can build our collective power, and what that means in terms of building solidarity across borders. So first of all, let's just be honest in this moment that we're living in. Even in the response to the global pandemic, we're all told no one is safe until everyone's safe. This is the COVID pandemic has shown us how we're all in the same boat. And of course, it's done anything but that. It's provided as an insight into how we're going to respond to these crises will be anything but universal and anything but global. First of all, we saw rich countries retreat to the nation state, competing with poorer countries for access to scarce health resources. We've seen health and economic inequalities, determined survival rates, deeply racialized. We've seen here in the UK, of course, you know, with both in terms of COVID impacts on mortality, and of course, who has been left behind? Migrant communities, those people who we deem to be able to be sacrificed here. And of course, in the global south, we've seen a whole scale idea that people can be sacrificed. Workers in the global south left destitute, large numbers of people left hungry, migrants walking hundreds and thousands of kilometers in search of safety, and the dead lying unburied across many countries. And some of you may remember those pictures of Ecuador last year, as Ecuador was paying debts to the IMF and being lauded by bankers and governments in the global north without the necessary money to be able to even bury their own dead. And of course, the poorest and most vulnerable left without any support from the state, as true here in the UK as it was globally. Why? We all know it's because the global north, our banks, our corporations, the government and the institutions from the World Bank to the IMF have systematically hollowed out the ability of the global south to meet the needs of its people. Structural adjustment programs that destroyed public services, privatized health provisions, prevented countries from protecting their local food protection, created economies designed for only one thing, which is commodity exports in the hands of multinationals to the global north. And of course, the worst is yet to come. This recession that we're already seeing being rolled out around is going to, of course, affect people here in the global north. And we've seen that the poorest, the most vulnerable are already at risk, are losing jobs and are already at risk. But it's in the global south we're going to see potentially the loss of half of all jobs. And this is a place where, of course, half the world is already struggling to survive on less than the equivalent of $5 a day. And already the World Bank and the IMF are saying hundreds of millions of people are going to be plunged into extreme poverty. These are people with little or no social protection. And of course, right in that moment, the answer from corporations and right-wing governments is we need to roll back hard-won labour rights in the name of competitiveness and rebuilding the economy. And we see the same thing happening, of course, here in the UK with the fire and rehire. And we see, of course, across large parts of the global south. So when we think about solidarity and we think about how we can build that solidarity across borders, of course, here, we must be fighting against economic injustice, and we must be fighting for living wages and guaranteed basic incomes. But those have to be universal. So our part of our job as progressive internationalists is being able to connect those fights here with the global, so that when we call for a living wage or universal public services, social protection and workers' rights, they apply for both the UK and globally. Nnimmo set out, of course, really well the permanent crisis for the global south that is being worsened by the climate crisis. You know, nobody needs to be a climate scientist anymore to know that killer storms, floods, droughts are devastating so many parts of the world, leading to collapses in food production, loss of livelihoods, and the state being unable to meet the costs of both adapting to this climate crisis and dealing with these economic losses. The IPCC, in its seminal report about 1.5, talked about it would be 70 trillion would be the cost of a 2-degree world. And we saw the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights say, we're creating a climate apartheid where the rich will seek safety while leaving the poor to die. And who will be the poor? Of course, it's going to be those people, the black, brown, indigenous people. So our solutions, and when we talk about these crises, of course, they've got to be anchored in this commitment to absolutely keep temperatures well below 1.5. And that really means countries in the global north doing their fair share. We know that means having going for zero emissions, not this net zero 2050 by 2030. We need to be able to have this. We're living literally in this decade zero, where every decision we make will determine the scale of the crisis being faced by people all around the world, and the number of people that will be displaced. And I'm sure Minnie is going to talk a lot more about the connection between migrant justice and racial justice. But the UN is already saying that 1 in 30 people will be forcibly displaced from their homes as a result of these multiple crises. And, you know, And what we have here in terms of rich countries like the UK, these genocidal targets of 2050 are all banking, of course, on imaginary solutions that we're going to be somehow going to be able to suck out carbon out of the atmosphere. We've done research, which I'll post in the chat, which shows that the UK's fair share of the carbon budget would be that we not only need to be a zero by 2030, but also transfer $1 trillion to the global south just to meet our mitigation effort. And that, of course, means not just shifting away from fossil fuels, but really thinking more profoundly about energy and food, thinking about it as a public good, shared equitably and not for exploitation. And even this talk that we're having at this moment, you hear it everywhere, governments, corporations, everybody talks about there's going to be a green recovery or green stimulus. Most of it is, of course, predicated on doubling the resource extraction in the global south. So the answer is not going to be electric batteries. It's actually going to be much more profound, asking what our economy is for, how do we build a just transition to build a care economy. But of course, also, incredibly, you have international institutions like the IMF that are calling on economies in the global north not to enact austerity, to borrow and invest in the green economy, whilst at the same time providing IMF loans to the global south, countries desperate as a result of the COVID pandemic, which have legal clauses in them obliging countries in the global south to enact even greater austerity and public sector cuts to vital public services as a result of this pandemic. So what can we do? Well, of course, we can make demands, of course, around the debt crisis that is shackling so many of the global south countries. We know 46 of the lowest income countries are already spending more on debt services than their healthcare systems. We need to move that conversation around debt towards calling for to actually around reparations. And I want to bring this, back to the UK. Most of us, and of course, some of us are on the streets with the Black Lives Matter movement last summer, but all of us recognise the important work that was done to shine the spotlight on the UK's past record and, of course, its present record around racism. But it has to go beyond the toppling of statues of slave traders. It has to recognise that, the UK, benefited and built the bricks and mortars of this country on the backs of slavery and colonialism. The $8 billion that was made from enslaving people, of enslaving African people, is in every brick and mortar, including, of course, there in Cambridge in the university. But not just slavery. During the British Raj, the UK looted 45 trillion from India alone. It's said that Britain never paid a penny for any of its wars or imperial conquests or its expansion from the UK to its capitalist expansion to Canada, the new colonies of New Zealand, Australia, and the Americas. That all of that was paid from profits from colonial extraction. So we know we're in this moment of capitalism facing a greater shock than the 2000 financial crisis, and these multiple crises are all compounding, and the very question of liberal capitalism is being questioned. But what's fascinating is that the right is already thinking about that and talking already about this great reset of capitalism, what their global recovery is going to look like. So the challenge for us is, how do we make sure that what comes next is not only fair and more equitable and more greener, but actually addresses the baked-in injustices, the baked-in racialized and gendered systems of oppression that are at the root cause of these multiple crises. So to do that, we have to have a vision. Of course we have to have a vision. Of course we have to have political demands, but we also need to rebuild solidarity and rebuild our new internationalism. Because if we don't, we already can see what the far right are doing. They're already mobilizing around the same crisis, saying that the mantra is the only way to solve these crises and survive these crises is walls and fences and nativism and the rise of xenophobia. And at the same time, yesterday, you may have seen, was it yesterday or the day before, the UK chairing the UN Security Council, talking about climate change as a great security threat. And we already know that the military-industrial complex are talking and saying the only answer to these crises is going to be a securitized and militarized responses. And you look back 25 years and look at the first reports that were drafted by the Pentagon about the militarized threat, or sorry, the security threat of climate change. And what's incredible in there are the two things it talks about. One, the need for building a wall in between the US and to prevent migrants from the Caribbean, from Mexico and from Latin America escaping the climate crisis ever crossing. And two, the requirement for a more militarized, a greater military presence all around the world, because we're going to see a new wave of resource wars and a fight for who has access to these resources. So we're in a seminal moment at this moment, you know, for a need for us to be able to connect our movements and our struggles so we can guarantee everybody the right to a dignified life. So how do we do that? Well, I say we have to look back at some of the lessons of which we had, of what was the anti-imperialist movement, what were the lessons of our movements, what were the lessons of our struggles, because, you know, it's important for us to recognize that there's period of struggle, you know, of these movements that are arising in the global south are not new. They're the same fights that have been taking place in the anti-colonial movement, in the anti-imperialist movement, in the anti-globalization movement, to now to the climate justice movement. And they profoundly ask the question, you know, of the right of people to have a dignified life. They ask the question for people here in the global north of what does solidarity to you mean? And I think the question for us of what solidarity means across borders is, of course, our responsibility, not only to listen to the story, not only to tell the story we tell of the world, not only to say, hey, let's center the voices of the global south, but to listen to their demands and center their demands, and then to act on those demands. And that is our responsibility, because of course, overwhelmingly, it's our banks and our corporations and our government that enacts many of the policies that deny so much of the global south the right to life. So our challenge, how do we connect the Black Lives Matter, the climate strikers, the labour movement around a genuine call for a jobs, justice and climate framework? How do we build our power, and who do we target? Well, we have a responsibility. The UK is hosting both the G7 and the COP26 this year. We have to be building a movement that is at its core anti-racist, that is at its core has the values of migrant justice, that recognises that the fights that are taking place in the UK have to be connected to the fights that are taking place in the global south. Our solutions are not going to be simply now to move from saying end fossil fuels to saying end fossil fuels and yes to renewable energy. If we see the same logic of extractivism at the root of that, we have to be moving much more profoundly and saying, who has the right to energy? How can we think about energy as a public good? How do we think about food as a public good? What kind of society and economy do we need to be able to have? And the best test case, of course, of that is how we understand migrant justice within that. The migrant justice movement, both fighting here in the UK, not only around against the hostile environment, not only against the pernicious role of the state, but against the super exploitation that our deregulated labour economy is creating, not only here, but all around the world. I think I'm being told to shut up, so I will shut up and say, I will just end on this last moment. This is a huge challenge, and I know, and sometimes it looks incredible that we're saying, how do we fix all of these global crises? But there is a window of opportunity for us to be able to do that. To do that, we not only have to be bold in our vision, but we have to be bold in our action. Thank you.
Amazing, brilliant. Thank you so much, Asad. You moved so expertly and adroitly between all of those themes, including the coronavirus pandemic, workers' rights, colonial histories. It was amazing, and it was so intriguing to oscillate between those. And I think that the case studies of Denmark and Ecuador that you highlighted are especially interesting. And I urge the audience to really take that question of what does solidarity mean to you with them, and to think about that in their own time. I think that's a great actionable thing that can happen out of this 1.5 hour session. I think now I'm going to pass back to Ken, and let's see if we can have connection with Ken again.
Yes, am I audible now? It's my audio good?
Yeah, try that, Ken. I can hear you right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm really sorry. Sometimes the internet in this part can be really terrible. Yeah, for the first 1 minute, I was talking about the region where I live and I've worked for the last couple of years, and it's the Niger Delta. I do not need to go into that history, but just to say that the effects of climate change are already very deeply with people in the Niger Delta. So we have got floods since 2012. We have seen sea levels in the Niger Delta rise to about between 5 and 15 feet every single year. And the flooding patterns in the Niger Delta occasioned by climate change is actually depriving people of their livelihoods, their source of living, eroding entire farming seasons and making it difficult for people to survive. And we are in Nigeria, we're already beginning to see patterns of climate migration. So in the Sahel region of Africa, we are beginning to see people moving because the Lake Chad is drying up on account of the encroaching desert. We're beginning to see conflict that is engendered by the climate crisis. So there's massive farmer header crisis that is basically fights between farmers and cattle rearers in Nigeria. We're seeing, of course, the Boko Haram insurgency, which we have carried out a research on and traced to the climate crisis. And we always ask the question when we're talking about the Boko Haram insurgency, why is it that it is in that part of the country where the Lake Chad has dried up between 4 countries, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Cameroon, that Boko Haram has found its strength? And our argument is simple, that Boko Haram has grown, fettered, and gained ground in that particular part of the world, that particular part of Africa, because there's a climate crisis in that part. And so we are seeing all strange effects on account of climate change happening in Nigeria at the moment. And it's funny, it's really funny, because we didn't create this problem. We did not create this problem. The portion of emissions credited to Africa is negligible compared to the rest of the world. But unfortunately, in the Niger Delta, in the middle belt of Nigeria, and in the Sahel region, the effects of climate change are mostly felt in those places. And it's actually, in resisting the very adverse effects of climate change, it has led us naturally to fighting the fossil industries in Nigeria. The battle against fossil extraction in Nigeria started sometime way back in the 1990s with the Ogoni struggle for self-determination and to leave the oil in the ground. And of course, I do not need to narrate how that struggle went. Ken Saro-Wiwa with 9 other Ogonis were hung. Over 10,000 Ogoni people were sent on exile. Some of them are still in exile till now, too traumatized to return home. And the mood of repression has not changed in the Niger Delta. It just remains basically the same. In the Niger Delta where I live right now, I step out on the street, there's a military truck parked, at my junction, on the streets, in the communities, everywhere. It is important to keep that military presence in the region, because it is only with such repressive presence of the military that oil can be extracted. And this is the condition upon which we've had to campaign and struggle. And our campaign has basically been a fight to insist that fossils need to be kept in the ground. That's our campaign, that fossil fuels need to be kept in the ground. And so talking about solidarity, while preparing for this talk, I read a document and it said that, it said something very instructive, that solidarity is not an alternative. It is not an option. It is the only chance we have got. It's the only chance we've got. And I think that the world is artificially divided when we speak about climate change. The world is artificially divided, and those divisions are not really real. I mean, they're not factual, and they're not real. And that's because the effects of climate change, climate impacts do not know those borders which we define. The climate impacts do not identify the border wall created by Donald Trump. It doesn't identify it. It affects all equally, okay? So a 20-foot wall makes absolutely no difference. And the effects the causes and effects are across continents. And this underscores the reason for us to build strong solidarity linkages across borders. I like this example, which I often give. And it is the example of that tiny community somewhere in the creeks of the Niger Delta where oil is being extracted nonstop, has been extracted nonstop for the last 60 years. Oil is extracted, burnt in Europe, and the gas is fled here. And that community does not understand that the fossil fuels extracted from its soil is what's leading to the desertification in the Sahel, or what's causing the monsoons happening elsewhere, or what's causing the ice storms elsewhere. That connection does not exist. And that's what solidarity needs to do. Help us draw the lines, create the links, identify the causes and effects, make the farmer in the creeks of the Niger Delta and the fisher folk understand that the oil extracted by BP in your creeks, in your waters, and in your lands is what's leading to the devastation, the increasing flood patterns that you are suffering currently. Now, what will solidarity look like? And it's a very important, and the speaker before me, Asad, mentioned the character of the solidarity, and I wish to speak a little bit about that. Prior to now, solidarity has always meant the global north, showing Africa the pathway, how we need to tread, what needs to be done. That cannot be the kind of solidarity which we forge in dealing with the global climate crisis. That solidarity would no longer work. It needs to be a solidarity of each of us holding our hands, exploring opportunities, exploring alternatives as partners, as equals together. It needs to be a solidarity that understands that even within indigenous African communities lies practices and cultural resilience that stands a chance of combating the global climate crisis. That's the level of solidarity, a solidarity of partners, and not a solidarity of the blind leading or the person seen leading the blind, Africans. That level of solidarity needs to change. And finally, I think that what we need to do is create a movement. And it's a kind of movement that cuts across borders, across spheres, across colors, and across peoples. It's a movement that tells the entire story. Because in Africa, in the Niger Delta where I live, the entire climate story has never been told. The relationship between fossil extraction and the climate crisis, the impacts we are seeing around the world, increasing sea levels, farmer header crisis, Boko Haram, desertification, those linkages have never, ever been created. And that's where solidarity comes in. Solidarity comes in at the point where we need to place all the dots where they belong, draw the lines, and create the platforms for unity and for collective action. I think that in terms of talking about transition, in terms of talking about solutions, right, that our thinking around solution needs to depart from the rather narrow fixation we have had on markets. I think that our solutions must address the consequences of decades of reckless and mindless extraction of fossils. I think that even in talking about a just transition and a new deal, whatever that deal is, it has to be a deal that repairs the years of ecological disaster that has been occasioned by fossil fuel extraction and the extractivism, which is our mainstay. I think that a just transition and a new deal has to be one that stems from the people, one that comes from their ideas and know-how and buys into their passion, one that restores their livelihood that was destroyed. And I think that it must seek to provide justice for the countless victims of climate injustice inspired by oil companies. I think that a just transition and any kind of solution must include reparations for people of the global south who did not contribute to the climate crisis, but have had to deal with it on a daily basis. I think that is the pathway to building solidarity, and those are the kind of solutions that our solidarity needs to begin to articulate. I hope you heard all of that.
We did, yes. I am so glad that we managed to connect to you again. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for highlighting that history of the Ogoni Nine and Ken Saro-Wiwa as well. That's definitely something I'm studying that helped me to realize the context of Nigeria. And Nigeria is very interesting in that it is one of the only, well, very few places in the world where there is such intense petro-violence and militarism. And I thought that the emphasis that you put on telling stories and what stories we tell was very, very interesting to me, especially as somebody who is within the English faculty at Cambridge. So that kind of creates new roles in terms of like arts and culture and thinking beyond perhaps public policy. So that's very interesting. I am now going to pass on to Minnie, our final speaker, who has just changed jobs, which is so exciting. Hopefully I get your new job right. So you are now Campaigns and Comms Director at the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. And you are a writer and campaigner specializing in migrants' rights, climate change, and social justice. And before joining the Joint Council, you worked on EU and UK parliamentary issues and were a policy expert. That is a great bio. Minnie, I'm sure I've seen you on Sky News as well. So yeah, great to be in your presence right now.
That's very embarrassing. But thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to everything that the panelists have already said. I couldn't agree more with the kind of issues that have been covered. I think what I would like to do is just add some UK context to all of the amazing things that have already been said. So as Anjum said, I work for a migrants' rights charity called the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. We're one of the oldest migrants' rights charities in the UK, and we provide immigration advice to all kinds of migrants, from asylum seekers to people trying to reunite with their families, to people who've been in the UK for a really long time without a recognised status. And we kind of use the experiences of our clients to inform our policy and campaigning work, and call on the government to level up the rights of all migrants. And more recently, JCWI has been trying to take a more holistic approach to the movement of people across borders and the way that migration is treated like a problem in the UK and across Europe and the global north, rather than a natural behaviour, because the reality is that the migration of people and more generally in nature, you know, amongst plants and other animal species, has always occurred, and it's a natural phenomenon or behaviour, especially where there are crisis situations or when environments change. I always try to think that the most kind of applicable philosophy here is actually from Jurassic Park, which is that, you know, life finds a way. And I think it's really fair to say that as the climate crisis continues to worsen, there will be a severe and noticeable impact on the kind of people that we work with, in that we will see new reasons and rationales for why people are moving across borders, and that will include because environments are no longer habitable. And that is sadly almost inevitable and is already happening in places like Bangladesh or Kiribati. And now, mostly people move across borders into kind of neighbouring countries, and as everyone has set out already, there is a lot to be said for finding solutions to the climate crisis, which give people the right to stay as well as the right to move, including, you know, better resources, infrastructure, technology, and the kind of principles of extraction that we need to reverse. That is equally as important, and I don't want to kind of imply that I'm not in favour of that stuff. I absolutely am. But what I'm saying is that there is, you know, that's one approach as a solution to the climate crisis, and migration is another approach. And there will be people who move or seek to move to the global north or to the UK, just how we already see, especially where those countries they're leaving have historic connections to the UK, whether that's the language or familiar communities here. So we have to start thinking about how we challenge anti-migrant narratives so that movement is not perceived as a security threat, and where people are allowed to enter the UK and live here safely. You know, as Asad said earlier, this is currently the way that world leaders, including Boris Johnson, already think about migration, and it's a way of thinking that they also impose on the effects of the climate crisis. You know, Boris Johnson said yesterday, climate change is a threat to our security, and what he is in part referring to is that people who are escaping climate impacts are a threat to security, and as everyone has already set out, that is Black and brown people in the global south, and is founded on a historically colonial and capitalist approach to the economy and to society. So what we have to do here in the UK is think about our existing migration system and try to fix it so that it gives people dignity and rights, especially for the people who are already here, and allows them to get on with their lives in the same way that anyone who has a British passport can, and also predicts the impacts of the climate crisis so that we create a system which facilitates movement. So, you know, the climate movement in the UK, with some very notable exceptions from the panel, has historically either not really considered the relationship between migration and climate change, or has perpetuated the idea of security. So people are coming here and we have to stop climate change so that they don't come here, or has focused on racist ideas around things like population control. There has been nothing that kind of systemically addresses the root of those issues. And what we as organisers and campaigners need to do is that forward planning of recognising that we need to challenge anti-migrant narratives as a solution to the effects of the climate crisis. And across Europe, we haven't seen any recognition that we need to facilitate movement rather than hinder it. You know, we've chosen to kind of vilify migrants, treat them as a problem, bar them from accessing vital support services. And the UK is at the forefront of propagating those views, and it creates systems which continually strip people of their rights and treat them as second-class citizens, particularly for people who arrive from countries in the global south. So I'm going to set out a bit what the system looks like in the UK and how we can kind of challenge it and dismantle it and build solidarity across movements in the UK, which is kind of a really important thing to do while we're thinking about how we globalise our movements. You know, we have to get that right here in the UK first. And I kind of want to talk about some of the campaigns here that I think could revolutionise the way we think about migrants in the short term, while we're trying to push for that longer term vision, particularly as we think about kind of recovery from the pandemic, and as Asad said, the kind of opportunity that this crisis presents us to kind of radically reimagine how we currently think about the economy and our systems. So we have something called the hostile environment, which I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of before, which is firmly in place, and if anything is even more instilled since the onset of the pandemic. And it is that system which really differentiates us from other places in the world, because it not only takes border enforcement away from geographical borders and puts it into public services, it makes ordinary people into border guards, and its very existence means that migrants who are undocumented or here without the correct paperwork simply can't come forward and have their own voices heard, because the threat and the risk of deportation or you know, any kind of consequence is so high, and you know, it is also a deadly system. You know, it stops people from accessing the vital help that they need. And you know, throughout the pandemic, we've seen this happen numerous times. There's been instances of people dying because they couldn't access healthcare when they needed it. That's just one example. But also on top of that, the system itself is racist. It has been proven to directly cause racial discrimination, not only for migrants, but for British people of colour. So it's a really toxic part of our society that really needs to be dismantled. And I think the key policies within that are something called no recourse to public funds, or shortened sometimes to NRPF, which stops the majority of migrants, whether or not they're documented, from accessing support services. I mean, it is the literal opposite of migrant steal benefits. You know, migrants do not have access to pretty much any benefit at this point in time, even if they've got the right visa or the right paperwork. Before the pandemic, that was pushing people into kind of destitution and hardship. It's forced people to kind of have to choose between self-isolating or feeding their family, because if they don't work, they can't access support. It has directly led to more severe COVID outbreaks. That's exactly what happened at the Boohoo factory in Leicester, and at the Bakkavor salad factory, where 2 migrants actually died from a severe outbreak in a factory. So that's the first policy that I think, while we're thinking about recovery, must really be a focus of campaigning and must be removed from our system. And the second policy is the right to work in the UK. So that is, if you are undocumented, you can't work here legally, even though the reality of the situation for many, many undocumented people is that they are working in the informal economy, because they have to find a way to provide for themselves, whether that's in care or sex work or on 0 hours contracts or for Byron burgers. But the right to work provision means that they can't complain about conditions. It's only ever the worst employers who hire them, because they know they can exploit them, and they can't unionize. And I think this provision is the real key to not only visibilizing a significant proportion of the migrant population that are undocumented, but also allowing them to unionize and push for their rights. This has been a key campaigning success in countries like the USA and Portugal and even Ireland. And I think there's a really clear link here between green jobs and green recovery and the right to work, and joining those struggles together. And then lastly, as Asad kind of mentioned before, I think the last real kind of the final ground for something that we need to really be prepared to campaign against in the next few years is the complete and utter crackdown on safe and legal routes of entry to the UK, which we have seen Priti Patel use as a kind of weapon to empower the far right and deny people their rights. And the government intends to further crack down on people entering via the channel and increase the securitization of our borders in a new immigration bill at some point in the next year. And I think I did a talk like right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I pulled out my notes from this, and right before the lockdowns occurred, and I'd written down, there is a real risk that the UK's response to tackling the pandemic or to coming out of the pandemic will mean an increase in nationalism and a narrative which talks further about controlling borders. Now, I am not a psychic, and I think it's just so obvious that that is exactly what has happened. And it's framed within this context, but the reality is that we have an extremely hard border regime. You know, as much as the government wants to spin it, permanently hardened borders is not the solution to a global health pandemic, which is also very much what the climate crisis is. So, you know, I think this is a really significant moment. We're going to be reimagining our economy and our society, and we have that opportunity to unite struggles and to change our narratives about climate crisis and migration. And as everyone else has said, it is important to place those who are most affected at the centre of our solutions and empower them to campaign on those issues too. And we need to ensure that the economy and a green recovery encompasses safe movement and migrants' rights. And I just want to reiterate, and I just want to finish by reiterating that what we're talking about here is movement, and movement is nothing to be afraid of. It's something that has happened for centuries. You know, people have moved and will continue to move, whether that is like a few miles or 100,000 miles. You know, we are not a sedentary species. And an end to borders is one of the only ways to ensure that we are properly adapting to the climate crisis. They simply, as they currently exist, do not have a place in this kind of globalized world, which allows the free movement of goods and services, but not people who choose or need to move. And I think if we've kind of learned anything from the last year, is that we really just don't have time to waste, and we can't afford to have solutions which really don't encompass everyone, and that vision kind of needs to be kind of global and brave and call for tangible, real action. So I think I'll just stop there because I've rambled on a bit, but yeah.
No, not at all. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Minnie. Thank you for highlighting the historic whiteness of the environmental movement as well. I think that's something that's very interesting to lots of people on this call who might be environmental activists. And also everything that you said about the hostile environment is worth thinking about in terms of the context of our universities and how our universities become border guards as well. So I'd urge students in this call particularly to think about that. I think now we are going to move on to the Q&A section of this event. I can see that there's lots of interesting discussion going on in the chat box, which is great. I have a feeling that the first question from Ashim was kind of answered in the chat already by various people. So I think I'm going to move on to the latest question, which was, should climate justice groups direct more energy towards directly to disrupt border imperialism? Yeah, hopefully our speakers can see this question in the chat. Does anybody want to have a go at answering that first?
I guess I can. The short answer is 100% yes. I think there hasn't been enough kind of focus on supporting existing campaigns and connecting those conversations about things like detention systems and the finances that go into the border regime, as you mentioned in the question, Frontex. And it essentially, you know, one of the things that the climate movement is really good at calling for is you know, not to invest in certain technologies or certain or fossil fuels. You know, divestment is like a key thing that climate movements are really good at, and you can directly apply that to things like the hostile environment and to investment in border controls and to detention centres, and like divestment strategies are kind of really important for that kind of work, but at the moment they don't really occur. And there are some really amazing campaigns which connect detention, for example, with climate justice. So, for example, a lot of people don't know that the Heathrow third runway, that was going to be built directly in the path of two existing detention centres, and the government had planned to knock those two detention centres down and build in its place a super detention centre. That's the government's words. That's a huge, massive, triple-sized detention centre right in the path of right next to the third runway, which would allow them to easily deport people. And the End Heathrow Immigration Detention campaign basically challenged that from the local community angle. And they were all constituted of climate activists, and they did so with very little financial support or involvement from the wider climate movement, because it was framed around migration, whilst it actually clearly had a climate link. It's literally an airport and a runway. You can't get more kind of clearly climatey than that. So I think it's really important to think about, if you're a climate justice activist and haven't really thought too deeply about migration as an interlinked issue, one, how you can apply those skills and connect those conversations. And I think that's really clearly what solidarity in the UK with migrants looks like, and across borders, particularly across the EU.
Amazing, thank you so much. I was like nodding so much when you were talking about using divestment strategies to counteract the border industry, because that's exactly what Eva is researching and something that we're trying to do at Cambridge as well. And I think it's so important. I have a question from Laura, who is my co-host, who's asked, and I will read it out, but perhaps Laura can also comment it in the chat as well. I think that would be quite useful. But Laura says, all of the speakers, but particularly Nnimmo, touched on the idea that young activists in the global South and North need to collaborate in order to seek just solutions. This feels so important, and I would love to hear advice from any of the panelists or facilitators on which platforms/groups are most suited to these international conversations and collaborations. Are there already existing transnational coalitions that we can get involved with? Thank you. Just jump in if you have any thoughts on that.
I can go, Anjum, if you want. And maybe I can also just say a few words about the previous question that Laura, that that was asked about by Jerome. I think we really need to break this idea that working class people or white working class people are this racist sort of constituency of people that if you go to them with justice arguments, that they are immediately hostile to that. I mean, that's simply not true. If you look at, for example, through the history of this country, right? I mean, you can look at amazing things. You can look at, for example, you know, when the slave trade was taking place and people would jump ship here in at the docks, you know, when people ran into the East End, the so-called, you know, worst area of London, you know, they were protected. They were protected from the state, right? Because people had a visceral hate of the police and the state. They had more solidarity. When the campaign against slavery took place here in the UK against Tate and Lyle and the sugar factory, the majority of people who boycotted sugar were working class people. The signatories, the thousands of people who signed the petition against Tate and Lyle were working class communities. When the US Civil War was taking place, you know, it wasn't working class people who bunched together to pay for a warship to break the blockade and allow cotton. It was Liverpool merchants. And despite the cotton famine that was taking place in Lancashire and Yorkshire with thousands of cotton workers destitute, it was cotton workers, working class people who refused to handle the cotton that came from the slave trade, saying they had more in common with the slaves than they had with the bosses of the cotton factories. All throughout our history, you know, you look at the formation of the trade union movement in this country. It came from the match girl strike. What the match girls were? Who were the match girls? They were the daughters of Irish migrants who connected with working class communities, working class people to lead that strike and to form. There's an incredible history of solidarity, right? The banners on trade unions, on every trade union, doesn't say workers of England unite. It says workers of the world unite. There's always been an incredible internationalism and incredible solidarity. The problem is that we, the progressive movement, have largely retreated from the work that needs to be done into about how do you rebuild solidarity? How do you build empathy? How do you build connections between people who are oppressed? And of course, in that space, we see the forces of the right who then weaponize racism and xenophobia and say to those who are suffering the most, this is all about, you know, who gets what crumbs of the little piece of cake, rather than us asking, why don't we have the cake as the whole of the cake, right? Why are we fighting about the crumbs? And that does require really hard work, and it requires the kind of organizing that I would call, you know, that was traditionally called community organizing. It's no good progressives only speaking to progressives. It means actually going out and winning fights, and it means connecting fights. So that's not just about, oh, well, that we should fight on migrant justice. We can fight on, for example, on air pollution, but the very nature of bringing communities together engenders the solidarity that then those communities stand up for each other. And we know that through every anti-immigration and every anti-deportation campaign that's ever been run in this country and has been successful has largely been supported by working class people of that community, because we built connections, we built solidarity. That is like hard and tough work, but it's not impossible. And I really don't believe, you know, the argument, and it's been not just here in the UK, but across, you know, Europe and the Americas, that if you do work, white working class communities and black and migrant working class communities can find solidarity. You know, we're about to see this new film that comes out in a couple of weeks about Fred Hampton, right? One of the revolutionary leaders of the Black Panther Party, you know, who was murdered in Chicago. I mean, you know, when you look at what he achieved, right, on the idea of building a rainbow alliance between poor white working class communities, black communities, and other communities of color, it's everywhere that we've seen progressive movements move forward, they have done because they've not ignored the question of race. They've taken it head on and understood that fundamentally it's and addressed it by addressing economic inequalities. And that has been true of the labour movement as well. You know, I'm old enough to remember my father worked in the knitting factories, right? And when my parents' generation came here, of being racially abused at work, in the workplace, sacked from the workplace, told that migrant workers were lowering wages, were the responsible, that white workers, if we wanted to protect their security, they had to side with the National Front. And of course, there were moments when what parts of the white trade union movement, white parts of the trade union movement were standing with the National Front, were supporting Enoch Powell. But then we had Imperial Typewriters strike. We had Grunwick strike, where migrant workers organised and demonstrated that fighting for migrant workers actually benefited the labour movement as a whole. That it was about the more we organised, the more we could lift everybody up. And I think that's a really critical lesson for us about what the climate justice movement sometimes thinks, oh, it's too hard to think about migrant justice because look at it, we're thinking about climate and it's a huge issue in itself. But unless we understand that even if you were sort of ignoring migrant injustice and racial injustice, simply wanted to solve the climate crisis, you have to start and say, do we have power? No, we don't. How do we build power? We can only build it through building the movement of movements. Who are the movements we can make alliances with? You automatically start to say that the movements that you can make alliances with these are all these. What are our common enemies? Okay, actually, it's the same financiers who are financing fossil fuels who are behind a lot of these migrant detention centres. It's the same corporations that you find common enemies, you find common targets, and you're able to actually build that kind of intersectional response, which isn't just abstract ideological in the thing, but actually real materially is put into operation in the way we campaign, the way we target things, the way we build our campaigns, and who we think needs to be in the room. And of course, we've come a long way from the days when we used to rage about bloody white polar bears and white icebergs as being the story of climate change, or the only time you ever saw black and brown people was when we were up on our necks underwater as images with no agency, no demands, and no idea that actually these very people were powerfully building movements and resisting, and that it was the UK and the US and Western countries which overthrew many of these movements and assassinated their leaders, who were calling for the very things that people now think are radical, of an intersectional response in the global north. These are all things that came from the global south and came from our movements. Sorry, a little bit of rant on that one. Sorry, now I forgot your other question, which you asked. Sorry, Anjum. You asked the question I was meant to answer.
So it is advice from
platforms
about international conversations and collaborations.
Sure. So I can post. Please sign up with War on Want. We're part of a global initiative. We're trying to work around what a radical global Green New Deal would be. That would centered basically, how do we keep temperatures well below 1.5 from a fair share perspective? How do we tackle inequality? You know, the fact that we sacrifice half the world to live on less than the equivalent of $5 a day. And I would say it's not $5 a day. Often people think they live on $5. The equivalent of what $5.50 buys in the US. And if anybody's been to the US, the equivalent of buying a $5, or what you can buy for $5.50 is basically a loaf of bread and one drink. That's what people are being forced to live on. We accept that. That's the upper end of poverty, right? We only care about extreme poverty, which is the equivalent of $1.95, which is basically you're not starving to death, but you're not living. We have to tackle the material use, this idea of extraction that the global north is built on, of resource extraction, of moving from fossil fuels to green extraction. And we have to address the inbuilt systems of oppression, racism and patriarchy that is embedded within these economic and political systems. We're working along that. What would that be? There are movements and campaigns. There's the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, which is predominantly a global movement, of movements in the global south that works around climate justice, that brings together everybody from street hawkers in India and Pakistan, to fisher folk, to people campaigning against fossil fuels, to frontline communities and affected communities. I mean, amazing work, amazing thing. They'll be there at the COP26. They're making interventions. There are so many spaces where these platforms and these conversations are beginning to happen. And, you know, I'm not saying that we have to look to the US for our politics, but I think when we look at what's happened in the US in recent years, in terms of the way that the environmental justice movement and the racial justice movement have moved the environment movement to the point where now we have parts of the environment movement coming out against draconian immigration controls, coming out against border wall policies. It's unheard of here in the UK that mainstream environment movements would say anything about migrant justice or anything about our walls and fences. That came about because in the US, movements forced those environmental NGOs to do that. We can do the same here. So I think it's not only about who we connect with, but also the power we have in an agency. The climate strikers and young people have been a breath of fresh air in terms of actually moving that paradigm and the frame of the conversation around climate justice and popularizing that. Now we need to deepen it and deliver some more concrete demands. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Asad. I was going to cut you off there, but I just felt really bad doing it because everything you were saying was just so relevant and interesting.
Rapidly.
I am going to bring in Ken now because some interesting questions for you, Ken, have come through. So somebody has asked, how can people, including students in the UK, support the struggle in the Niger Delta? And I will also just ask you two questions as we're close to ending. What is your experience of fighting the militarization and the petro-violence of Niger Delta? So talking about that more specifically.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the first question is, okay, I'll start with the second. The second is experience fighting the militarization in Niger Delta. Okay, so let me put it this way. I was born in the Niger Delta, and as a kid, the Delta was already militarized. So the militarization of the Niger Delta did not start with the extraction of crude oil or with Ken Saro-Wiwa, or it didn't start 10, 15, 20, 50 years ago, okay? In the 1900s, the Niger Delta was already militarized even without crude oil. It was a hub of trade. In 1895, I think, the British government sent its military to bomb a place in the Niger Delta called Akassa. Okay, it was a thriving trading port in the Niger Delta at the time. It was bombed, and the British took over the control of the palm oil business at the time. And so the Niger Delta has always experienced the wedlock of business and military. It's been a very dangerous wedlock of corporate interests backed by military terror and aggression. When the oil business in the Niger Delta kicked in, and it is reported that oil exports began in commercial quantities in 1956 in the Niger Delta, it was a natural flow, okay? The only difference is that the force of repression became the Nigerian security forces. And then the item of trade stopped being palm oil and became crude oil. But the relations of production remained essentially the same, you know, and the crude oil business has operated with the same level of impunity and repression as the palm oil trade before it. And so we have never known a time in the Niger Delta, at least in the last 200 years, where the region was not militarized. We have never known that time. And for a lot of young people in the Niger Delta region, the response to military repression has been to also create a balance of arms. And so it began with people in a community like Umuechem in 1990, demanding a better deal from the oil company Shell, and they were met with brutal force. 4 years after, in 1994, the Ogoni people demanded the same deal. It was met with brutal force. The important thing is that the first stretch of struggles by the people of the Niger Delta were non-violent struggles. But each non-violent struggle by the people of the Delta was repressed and met with violent force. And so people began to think, listen, non-violence doesn't work any longer. We better arm ourselves in order to push our arguments strongly. And that's why you do a Google search in the Niger Delta, everything that pops up is violence in the Niger Delta region. But that violence is the character of the oil business driven by multinational oil companies in collaboration with the Nigerian states. And so how have we managed to fight this corporate wedlock of profit and repression? We've done that by mobilizing local communities to continue speaking up. Unfortunately, we do not have a system in Nigeria at the national and subnational level, or even with the judicial system, that ensures that we get justice. And that is why solidarity is important. A very good example of how we have been able to leverage on international solidarity is in demanding justice for people whose rights have been violated by oil companies. Recently, at least in the last 2 weeks, two landmark judgments around infringement on the livelihood rights of community people was handed down by courts in Europe. And we're seeing an increasing number of Nigerians, Niger Deltans, taking their cases to courts in the UK, in the Netherlands, and elsewhere, because the courts in Nigeria belong in the pockets of the federal government, and the federal government is in an alliance with the oil companies, and they will never grant you justice. We would never perhaps been able to get such favorable judgments in those courts if there was not an active collaboration, alliance, and solidarity between activists in the Niger Delta and activists in Europe, who carried the placards when the need was when it was necessary, who went to the courtrooms when it was necessary, who filed the charges when it was necessary, and who collaborated and gave feedback when it was necessary. So yeah, that is how we have been able to deal with that very dangerous alliance. And then there was a second question. I forgot that question. Could you remind me? Promise I'll be fast with it.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Ken. Just very, very quickly, perhaps in a few words or one sentence, what can UK students do to support the Niger Delta context?
Cool. Well, I think that, so it's simple. The Niger Delta is a major source of global greenhouse emissions. That's fact. Either it is through gas flaring or through fossil fuel extraction. It's a major source of greenhouse gases. And I think what UK students can do to support the struggles of the people in the Niger Delta is to join the campaign to demand an end to fossil extraction. You know, this is a very unpopular position, even in the Niger Delta where I live, yeah? If I go out in a public function and I say, stop oil extraction, I could be stoned. But that's the reality. And I always present this argument that the Nigerian government does not imagine that it is even possible to exist and function without fossil revenues. But the Stone Age did not come to an end because the world ran out of stones. There were still stones. The fossil age is at an end. And that end is being brought even more predominantly by the fact that it is poisoning our planet and cutting our life shorter. We are feeling the impacts dangerously. And so what can UK students do? Join forces with students in Nigeria who are already fighting a very, very bold and courageous battle to push back the oil industry. It's to join hands with those Nigerian students, Nigerian workers, and Nigerian companies to ensure that the age of fossil fuel comes to an end.
Thank you so much, Ken. I think that brings our panel to a close. Thank you to all of our speakers for being so generous with your time and your knowledge and your ideas. This has been amazing. And thank you so much to the People and Planet team for making it happen as well. And also just many thanks to the audience for showing up and bearing with us while we had those technical issues at the beginning. I think I will just plug that People and Planet are doing a day of action tomorrow. So this kind of touches upon that very final question from Lubem, who is looking to make a youth-driven movement. I think People and Planet are very much working on this right now, and more information from People and Planet can be found on the website. I think Nat's just shared the link. And Yes, thank you so much to everyone. It was so good to see you, and I hope you have lovely evenings and lovely dinners.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ken. Bye.